Holy Spirit might use here. But even so, that these verses is just packed. These words are very efficient, very very deliberate, and as a result, I want to use look at a few of the questions to help us walk through this discussion. Question number 1 asks, what does the word image mean in chapter 1 of verse 15? Okay. It's not the person, but it's a representation. And usually then the physical image, like if you're thinking about a photograph, well, it represents, well, it used to be photos don't lie, but now, there's Photoshop and all kinds of other things. So you may or may not be able to, but it used to be that if you captured something, you captured an image, you pointed a camera and you operated the shutter and all that, and you captured the light onto this plate, that was it. That was the actual physical record. There's no way of doctoring that. And the images in the pictures didn't lie for a while because there was no way to make them show something that they didn't. And that's kind of the idea here. But Jesus isn't merely a photograph into this image, but he is recognizable. And this harkens back to, well, how would we, the scriptures tell us that no man has ever seen God. Adam walked with God. The Spirit of God walked with Adam in the garden. There are those like Moses who said that God spoke to face as one would a friend, but that's metaphorically. It also goes to great lengths to say that Moses never saw God. He got close enough so that Moses' appearance was changed. He was in the presence of God long enough to have a glory tan, as it were. That his countenance, his skin gave people a start and made them. They wanted him to veil the fact that he was wearing God's glory. He had been in God's presence, and God's reflected glory was coming from him. David was a man after God's own heart, but I don't know of any instance in the scriptures, even though David and God were close, and God sent messages to David through his prophets and other means. I don't know that they ever were face to face. You may remember from a recent lesson about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That after they were thrown into the furnace, that there was a fourth person in there walking with them who looked like he might be the Lord. That was the speculation of Nebuchadnezzar in his course, that it's one like the Lord is in the furnace with him. Point being is that when John says no one has ever seen God, when he's writing that in the first century, so far as I know, and what the scriptures tell us, that's true. There's no one who has been in the direct presence of God that would know what God looked like. But we have this person, Jesus Christ, who is the image of God. He is God in his totality. Now he's still God the Son. He is as much God as you can be, except being the Father or the Spirit. He's still a distinct personality, but he is in every measure God. And in fact, he had a physical body, and he left a physical, and he left footprints. Left marked. He probably as growing as a human being, injured his body. Had marks and characteristics on it that would make him distinctive. Matter of fact, you may remember after he was crucified, he was able to demonstrate the wounds. Okay, he was not unmarked by his life here, but nonetheless, in his visage, and when you saw Jesus, you met Jesus, he was fully God. Fred, you had comment?
I say the second part of that verse, no man has seen God and follows by saying, or can see God. God is spirit, and being in his presence, I think he probably was just consumed.
Well, that's. That's part of the argument. They said Jesus couldn't be God because he was bounded by a body. He was in this physical form. That disqualifies him right there, because that's the exact kind of argument that people were making. But he's not also bound by the limitations that human beings are. He's not bound by the physical laws of the universe.
It also says we are created. God created us, and so there are attributes of God that he has built There's something we can never approach, but there's something in order that we might be able to use the attempt that He has given us.
I think that's fair to say too. But I say that when man is created in His image, I don't think that God has opposing thumbs and is bipedal and his eyes face forward. I don't think he's bound by that. He's a different kind of being altogether. But for Jesus, for the qualifications for Jesus to complete His mission, He had to live as one of us. He had to have the full human experience to be able to fulfill His mission. And He did that, but never gave up being God. And that's just hard for us to wrap our minds around. It's hard enough for us to even think about someone outside of our realm, some being outside of our realm that desires fellowship with us. That's hard enough for us to cope with. But then to say that someone from that side came over here and lived as one of us, and all the problems that we can think of with that. How do you pour God into this finite bottle? But nonetheless, this is this claim that Jesus was in fact, and God's was in fact pleased to dwell in Jesus' body. And not that it was fun for Him or anything like that. That wasn't that it was a fun ride, but that it in fact accomplished God's purpose, and God was pleased with the outcome. That it talked about even Jesus growing up in the favor of God and man, as a young lad, that He grew in favor in all the ways that He grew up. That Jesus accomplished the mission the way that God intended for Him to do so, and God was pleased with the outcome. He was pleased with the process, and all that's I think being talked about in this particular passage. This word of image is the idea of saying it's in its totality. It's not that Jesus is a copy of God, but Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Galilee, Jesus who demonstrated Himself as our sacrifice, Jesus the Christ, the Savior, the Messiah, Emmanuel. All those names that the Scriptures refer to Jesus as, He lived as a physical man. And this is not some kind of an abstract, it's hard for us to think about, and almost have to use abstractions to even be able to contain the ideas. But Jesus was that realization, that totality of God as He lived here. In the second question, why is it so important that we have a correct understanding who Jesus is regarding His deity? Cynthia.
Well, that's a really deep topic, but I picked out three things to mention. One is the fact that Jesus is divine adds credibility to His words and actions, and it's a fulfillment of prophecy, and it's a confirmation of how much God loves us.
Okay, all of those things. That Jesus, in fact, that we understand, even if we can't explain it in every dimension, we don't understand it in depth. The whole idea of how, Jesus, what did Jesus realize as an infant? Was He fully adult conscious as an infant? I don't know. Scriptures don't tell us. To my mind, there's no way of being able to determine that. But He lived a full human experience. All the changes that a body undergoes as it goes from infancy to childhood to puberty to adulthood, Jesus experienced all that, 30 years worth. And He experienced that as we experience it, which again makes Him uniquely qualified to fulfill His particular role. We have to understand that He wasn't just a real good teacher, wasn't just the carpenter's son, that somehow or another the Spirit of God dive-bombed during the last 3 years of His life, or during the last instant when he was being killed, so that He could be divine for those few seconds before He died. That's not the picture the Scriptures give at all. The pictures tell us of Jesus, of God living as a man, of His example and His experiences, and we need to understand that to the best of our ability and understand what He represents in that. And that we are, in fact, we're talking about, while Jesus walking the earth, we're talking about the Creator of the universe visiting us. This also makes a big distinction. It has some things that are in common with the mythology of the time, but is different in so many ways. That among those that were different, particularly, Zeus seemed to be a randy kind of god. He chased a lot of women, and had children, and these children had various powers and such, but they were, the word is demigod, and Jesus wasn't that. Jesus wasn't a kind of God. Jesus was God in full measure. And it's important that we recognize that about him so that we put weight to his teaching. We recognize who it is that we really serve, and we recognize also the weight of his promises. When he promised things, when he says, upon this rock I will build my church, he wasn't fooling around. It wasn't a euphemism. He genuinely intended to do that, and in fact, that's what the scriptures show us doing. And so we have God building his church. Well, should that matter? I think among churches, if you were trying to pick one, that the one, and you were genuinely concerned about, pleasing God, that the church that God built would be at the top of your list. Right? I mean, we would recognize the import, the ripples that come out of the weight of the events as they unfold in the New Testament as a result of who Jesus is. Then we get to the point that Eric was talking about a couple of Wednesday nights ago about the preeminence of Jesus and the fact that he was part of creation. He was there at the very beginning. Exactly some of the same words, same kind of phraseology we see from John 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that what Paul's talking about here it just gives us, we're looking at it from a different angle. He's describing the same thing that John is, we're just looking at a different facet of it. It portrays in a language here to me about Jesus. It was when God said, "Let there be light," that this is something that God, all three personalities agreed on. And it was like the Father issuing commands and the Spirit and the Son executing those commands. That all the things came into being were coming into being through Jesus' exercise of his power as God, following the instructions from God the Father. And who said what when? I don't know that that's important, other than the fact that God claims ownership for the universe, and Jesus in particular. Jesus was uniquely qualified as a visitor to visit us here, as the creator of the universe, to take his creation out for a walk, as it were, by living here. If you want to think about it that. It's not merely his by the fact that it was created by his power, but he actually lived here for a while. I think that's kind of unique anyway. There's so much about this. It really, the use of these terms are really, really important. They're very weighty. And the next one, I don't want to get, we can literally spend the whole class time talking about one of these things, but let's talk about, in question number 3, what does firstborn mean? In chapter 1 and verse 15. What does that suggest? There's at least 2 aspects that I want to touch on. So you got a 50-50 chance of guessing the one I'm thinking of. Hazel? Okay, superiority and status and preeminence. In the Old Testament, the firstborn occupied a special place, and he got a double portion. And I'm not saying Jesus gets a double portion. That's not what this is saying, I think. He's talking about the preeminence. And as the only begotten Son, John 3:16, of course, he's firstborn, he's only born in that aspect. So I don't think that's what's being underlined and underscored here. But I think that and he goes on to talk about later in this passage about Jesus being the firstborn of the dead. What does that mean? Althea? Okay, and that's a big point. There were others, and in fact, Jesus himself had raised others from the dead. And so, even by exercising of his power here on earth, he was not the first one to rise from the dead. So this firstborn of the dead has another connotation. And it's the one I think that Althea has summarized very well. You might say, well, he was the firstborn of the kingdom. I'm going to split some hairs there. That technically, after dying on the cross, being raised after the sacrifice, then that is the beginning of the Christian age. But the kingdom didn't come with all the promises that were afforded it until a few weeks later. And so technically, yes, Jesus was the first one raised for the dead after he died on the cross. So yeah, that's That's a fact, but I don't think that's that kind of firstborn here. It is talking about the preeminence, and it is talking about the fact that he was the firstborn of the kingdom that will not die again. He won't face death again, and those are people who are faithful to him, who are his children, who are his subjects in the kingdom, they also, having died once again, having died on earth, will not die again. And so he is the model. He's, again, uniquely qualified. He is literally the trailblazer, the one carrying the banner for us as being the firstborn of the dead. He represents the hope that we have. If all we hope is to get through this life and be recognized as members of his kingdom and say, okay, that's it for y'all. Y'all are done. You can do what you want. That's not what the scriptures are telling us at all. That there is purpose beyond that. And that purpose beyond that is represented by the fact that you've been resurrected. Now you're going to say, well, everybody's going to be resurrected. They're all going to be resurrected. All the dead's going to be resurrected to face judgment. And Christians will face judgment too. But when the judgment comes and when all the things are revealed in our life, when it comes time for sentencing, Jesus is going to intercede and say, he's one of mine. They're one of mine. And for the folks that don't have that benefit, then they've been resurrected to destruction. They've gone from not only from like these, as the author pointed out here, the enemies of God have had a change of status at that final judgment. They're no longer the enemies of God. They've been vanquished. They're the conquered of God, and they're receiving judgment. And that change in status is also part and parcel of God's plan. But I digress. So there's so much in here to get drawn away from. Understanding who Jesus is and the preeminence that he has in creation, and the fact that he's in the language here, he's holding it all together. Now I understand that doesn't mean that God has to exert a constant force of will to be able to keep life running in the universe. In Acts 18, where Paul quotes from one of the Grecian prophets, it says that in him we live and breathe and have our being. One way of understanding that is God is literally making us breathe. He's constantly, through an effort of his will, providing us with air molecules to breathe. That could be an interpretation of that. But to me, it's equally true if God set up an ecosystem here on Earth, where the planet makes its own air, which is in fact what the scientists tell us happen. This balance, how we like to have green things, like having things growing around us. Well, that's also beneficial to us if you like breathing, because they consume the carbon dioxide that we exhale and turn it back into oxygen. God created all that. God put all of that in place. That process belongs to him. He invented it. And so he is, by virtue of the fact that process is still working as intended, is providing us with the air that we breathe. That air clings to the surface of the planet, held in force by gravity, which he also invented. And so, he sustains life. He provides life to us, but not through a constant, he's not limited to, he's not bound by a constant exertion of his will to keep all of our hearts beating and our blood flowing in our bodies. Because he designed us to work, to continue working, less a problem, less an interruption, an accident, some kind of fault in the equipment. The equipment works as specified, and that, in fact, is God's fault. He made all that happen through his design. And so you can understand this as God being literally there, constantly vigilant, constantly awake, constantly exerting an effort to hold everything together and sustain life. To me, that's not the only interpretation of this passage. God is no less powerful from having put all these things on earth to sustain life. That's where they came from, right? We as Christians understand that. Scientists will argue about it, but in fact, part of the problem with the scientists is they want to put God into the bottle that they live in. And part of the difficulty with coming to grips with the scriptures is that God is above law. As the inventor of law, as the lawgiver, He's also has the discretion to choose which ones he's bound by. He not only makes laws, he's not accountable to them. Right? Fred's shaking his head. But But he's not bound by the he's not bound by the laws of physics. He's not bound by time. He's not bound by attention. You're right. And there are parts of his person, parts of his being, which we struggle to understand. There are parts about being God that he can't violate and not be God. I mean, and that's he's bound by that too. But he's not bound by the laws of physics. The scientists scoff at the creation account and say, the stars, God put all the stars in the heavens, but it takes 2 million years for the light to reach the earth. If you're bound by the laws of physics, if you're bound by the speed of light. But God's not. He snapped it into being. He said, he didn't snap it into being, he spoke it into being. Snapping was too much work. Do you understand that God is not bound by it? It's like, well, God can't do that, because, that violates the law of gravity. Big deal. God invented gravity. He can circumvent it whenever he wants. Time. Well, God can't break time. He invented time so that you could tell how long a day was. Time, at one measure, and we humans, we study time and catalog it and dictate it in all kinds of detail, but time literally keeps track of the motions of the heavenly bodies. Really? Right? You say, no, it's the distance an electron flows, how long it takes an electron to flow and how long it takes to go a meter in length. It's that too. That there are all kinds of clever ways that we've invented to measure it, but really time is a measure of how the universe around us is moving, or how we're moving in that universe. That's all time is. And God can intervene, and he can, it's one of the, I gotta get a bucket of cold water here because I'm about to rant. But you know how you kind of see God in your image? If you're a physician, you see God as this healing power. If you're a parent and you see the love of God, you kind of that's the preeminent quality that you think about maybe with God. Well, as an engineer, as a designer, I marvel at God's design. And one of the biggest things and most impressive things to me is that God can work on it while it's still moving. He doesn't have to shut it down to fix it. He can work on it while it's in motion. That he knows intricately how it works and knows how to make it work differently without having to shut it down, without having to back it up, without having to reboot. That's astounding to me. Again, I'm not nearly in the category, but as someone that's fascinated by design, this really impresses me, and it impresses me a lot. And so you get to no extra charge for the rant. Mike?
In Peter, he says that 1,000 years is a day, the day is 1,000 years. I think it's almost like God can look at time as like a Rolodex, so he lives outside of it, so he can exist in the 1500s and now simultaneously. So
Exactly.
He can move wherever he wants, whenever he wants, however.
And that's a feature of his being not only not all powerful, but being everywhere, omnipresent. Is that he's literally as present as he was in the 1500s, at lunch in the 1500s, as he is in lunch an hour from now. He is equally present in every moment, all simultaneously. We can't. I mean, that hurts to even say out loud. God's not bound by the scientific laws. He made those. He made the speed of light. He made the acceleration due to gravity. He made the tensile properties of glass and rubber. He invented that. That's all part of his design. And he can circumvent it whenever it pleases him. He's at a different level than, the way that people were thinking about with these philosophies and such and spirituals. He's operating at a completely different level than they were. They thought that they were thinking about things in the totality. But in fact, they were thinking way too small when they start thinking about God. And it's not God the Father, it's God, Jesus Christ. He's that guy. That's the one that they sent to earth to die and to put us in his kingdom, to enable us to have fellowship with God and put away the enemy, to reconcile us. It's that guy. The Creator stepped in and intervened in the process. See the weight that's being attached to this? That Paul he's just piling it on. And it starts making you think, well, and has the desired effect, is after reading this passage, why would you seek anyone else? When it says he's the fullness, well, what's left out? Nothing. He's all that there is. There's no one at a higher position. No one that is fuller or better or more complete than he is. And that deserves our attention. That deserves our when those kind of claims are made, and you've been taught about this and have access to that, why would you trade down? Why would you switch to something inferior? Is the question that ought to be looming. The question that you start thinking is, Jesus described in this kind of language, why would you pick anything else? What more could you say that would elevate Jesus in your eyes than in this passage, from 15 to 20? I don't know. We could maybe find, if we were able to meet the physical Jesus, we decided he had kind eyes, or we like the sound of his voice. There might be something like that we could, some other kind of polish that we could put on that. But it wouldn't change these characteristics. It wouldn't change this exalted position that's being described here. Paul then goes on to describe, in the next passage, beginning of verse 21, to saying, as a result, kind of a result of the previous sentence about through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on heaven or earth, making peace by the blood of his cross. That all this preeminence, all this elevation that we're given to Jesus. To me, the thing that lots of things are in your mind, and lots of things and extrapolations that you make, but I go back and think then, well, what's the real impact of his sacrifice? If in fact he was the creator of the universe and had the supreme power to create and put in motion all this stuff around us, he's not just a guy who died in the first century. That he willingly came and fulfilled this mission and laid down his life and paid this price in our stead has a lot more weight, don't you think? He's not a substitute. He's not somebody that God just circled up out of the rank and who wants to go to earth and die? I got a mission for somebody among you angels. Who wants to go? It wasn't that scenario at all. It's a willful, deliberate plan that put Jesus here. He put himself here in accordance to that plan and offered himself knowing the full weight of his actions. David and then Fred.
One thing I think we need to remember, Christ being deity and being there after creation, he was the only one that was qualified to do that, to really fulfill that. There's no other creation or nothing else had been created that could do that.
Certainly not. And I'm thinking, my rub with that is not at that point. That for Jesus to be fully qualified to be the sacrifice in our stead, he had to come to earth. He had to live as us. And so, the creation, dial it back a few thousand years, whenever that occurred, that Jesus was not yet fully qualified. That's my rub with that statement. But he was uniquely qualified. They could have chosen another member of the Spirit or the Father could have come to earth and fulfilled this mission. Couldn't they? I mean, that's how many angels dance on the head of a pin. That's something unknowable. But I mean, what was required is a sinless sacrifice. There were probably other candidates that could be chosen, but none, as a creator, would be more eminently qualified than Jesus Christ. And I think that's the point that you were drawing our attention to. That Jesus is fully and uniquely qualified in all of history to be able to perform this mission. Fred and Todd.
I think we've talked all around this morning with the fact that for one person to die and take away all the sins of the world, that person has to be infinite. And only God can be infinite. Therefore, Jesus
And that's what our author points out is this, what's the phrase that he used? In the reconciliation, overt behavior conducted to remove the hostility. Okay, it's not I forgot what we were arguing about. Let's just let bygones be bygones. Let's put this aside and move on. It's not that. It's someone made willful, deliberate, overt actions to smooth over the problem, to be able to pay the debt, to satisfy the need, that someone intervened to make this reconciliation possible. It wasn't something, it's not accidental, he didn't back into it, or, well, I was coming here anyway, I decided I'd go ahead and do you all solid. It's not like that. This is all part of a willful, deliberate action that Jesus took to be able to reconcile creation, to get creation back, to achieve the state that God initially started out with his creation when he walked with man in the garden. That's ultimately, that's full circle what Jesus came to accomplish. And that's what he's provided us that opportunity to be able to do. Todd?
I'm going to answer your question now. No, God, Holy Spirit could not have done. Goes back to what you said earlier. God is bound by something. He's bound by his character and his promises. And that was his plan all along.
And I guess they could have drawn straws or, however rock, paper, scissors determined as to who was going to come. Or it could have been a very plan at the outset. That Jesus could have said that for this plan to work, I'm going to have to go. And that would also satisfy, I think, the criteria. It's weighty stuff to think about, really. And we can talk about it and speculate about it a whole lot, but the scriptures are amazingly efficient in how they tell this. Look at the time that we've spent talking about, something that takes 2 minutes to read. And that's my fault, I know. You can blame that on me. But you understand that there's a lot to grapple with here. There's a lot to think about. And when ultimately in this, that it gets around after putting Jesus in his place inside of creation, and then putting Jesus in his place inside the kingdom, which is as what? What's Jesus' place in the kingdom? He's the head. He's the king. And it kind of speculates here, what's the body without the head? Well, it's heart, lungs, and liver, right? And fingernails, and it's a bunch of stuff. But without the head, you might, if my head were removed, my body preserved, you might say that guy looks familiar. I think that's somebody I used to know. You might actually recognize something of me, but really, without the stuff that comes from this far up, that's me, right? The parts aren't completely interchangeable, but they're not remarkable. It's the stuff that occupies here that's the unique and remarkable part. And that's the part that Jesus represents to the kingdom. That the parts, the members of the body, that the church, for all of its benefits and all the accolades, however much we enjoy being members of this local community, or even the grander spiritual community, without the head, it's just a nice to have. It fails to meet, it's not fit to use. It fails to meet the designed intent. If the head is the most preeminent position. And so what this kind of lends some weight to is that the church isn't just just pick one. You ought to be a member of a church, find one that you like, find one that's nearby, people dress like you and talk like you, and just be part of a church because it's really important. You ought to be part of a church, just pick one. I'm not saying that if you understand who Jesus Christ is, then the church he built goes to the top of the list. There is no substitute. You can accept, everything else is decidedly inferior. It's a church that somebody else built. That if you want to be part of the body of which Jesus is head, then being in the kingdom is critically important. And being in the kingdom being used interchangeably here for the church, it's also, and I don't think about churches being bound by these walls. This is just an instance. This is a group of us who believe alike are working and worshiping together. That's nothing like the glory and the magnificence of the body of the saved eternally. or throughout all of history and eternally. That's at a whole nother level of glory and preeminence. And we shouldn't completely substitute one for the other. But being a representative, being a part of a physical body that fits into, that's a manifestation of the body of which Jesus is the head, that starts to take on weight. Michael?
You're talking about like being able to know the view from here up, but without from here up, everything else like the liver and the lungs won't work. They just occupy space. They don't pump. They don't do anything.
That's true.
The head is what makes everything else work.
There's some of that stuff.
Jesus, we're just here in a room.
Some of that stuff runs on autopilot to some degree. There's some, and I don't know if your brain actively says beat heart, beat, beat heart, beat. There's something in there, but a lot of it runs, so long as it's all the systems are healthy and activated, some of them kind of run on autopilot. Well, there's certainly going to leak a lot of fluid. You're going to leak a lot of those essentials out. And yeah, some of that's just going to stop without the head altogether. But it all intervenes together. The head gets to be critically important in that aspect in this particular metaphor, and thus being a part of this head and our response to that. I like the idea is beginning in verse 22. He is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. That they sing about us in the first in verse 21. This reminds you maybe passages in Ephesians or Corinthians maybe. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he is now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel which you have heard, which is proclaimed in all creation under heaven. We aren't, having been reconciled, we don't misbehave, or we don't behave well. We don't behave in a way that's pleasing to God so that he'll pat us on the head, or that we're earning points to make sure that we got enough to cash it in for our trip to heaven. We behave in response to what he has made us. He made us, he reconciled us into this body that is holy and blameless and above reproach. That's what Jesus has done for us. What are we doing with that? Are we living up to expectations? Look at the spec. We've been reconciled to be holy and blameless and above reproach before him. That's what the reconciliation produced, was a creature that fit these qualifications. We're not so good at staying that way, so what I'm going at. But that's the expectation. We weren't created to occupy a membership slot in a roster somewhere. This is the means by, or the reason why we enjoy these privileges. This is the reason why we were created. God reconciled us into this state so that we can do good works. So that we don't go back to doing what we've done before. You're not given a license to do that. So it's great that you came to Jesus, but now we see you at Judgment Day. That's not the relationship at all. Now we've been repurposed. We've been factory refurbished to a state that's fit to use, to be blameless and holy, and to dedicate ourselves to good work, to do good works. And thus that we can, our means of doing that is remaining in the faith. That we continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you have heard. That's the way, that's having been reconciled, that's the thing that's going to keep us in that reconciled state, is remaining in the faith. Kind of changes your mission statement, doesn't it? And maybe changes your output. Maybe it might even impact your plans for the day. That's the intention. That's what God has intended in reconciling us and putting us in this body of which Christ is the head, so that he established these attributes in us and intends for us to maintain them. That's our time. We'll continue in lesson 5 next week. Thanks.